This is the Editor's Half Hour. Step into the life of an editor for 30 minutes as we discuss the craft of editing, industry trends, and editorial resources. Your host is co-founder and CEO of Peak Publishing Inc., Nadia Jaja Pupa. She is experienced in all facets of the publishing industry, from editing to design, and works with corporate clients and self-published authors. Nadia and her guests are about to share powerful insights and stories on what it takes to be an editor. And this is your host, Nadia Jaja Pupa.
Welcome, listeners, to the Editor's Half Hour. Today's episode is one that gets to the heart of editorial work, which is manuscript evaluations. This is where editors step in early, often before the manuscript is truly ready. We help shape the direction of a project in a way that can make or break its future. So today, I am joined by Steph, an editor who brings both precision and perspective to this process. She understands that an evaluation isn't just about identifying what's not working, it's about showing writers what could work and giving them a clear path forward. So in this conversation, we're really going to be unpacking the method behind evaluations. This process is full of decision-making. It's a responsibility that comes with delivering this big picture feedback. So it does align a lot with developmental editing. So we'll have that conversation too. And I know Steph and I we went back and forth about that. But I do plan to talk about what it takes to build this into a sustainable service that you can complement with your freelancing professional services. There's so much that we can do in addition to copy editing. And so we're going to talk a little bit about setting those boundaries and what it looks like to price this type of work. So if you've ever wondered what it takes to approach a manuscript evaluation, this is the episode for you. And I am so happy to have Steph Thompson on the podcast. So welcome, Steph. Welcome to the Editor's Half Hour. Please introduce yourself and tell our listeners what you do.
Thank you, Nadia. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited for our conversation today. And like you said, I am Steph Thompson. I'm the owner of Ink and Insight Wordsmithery. I am a freelance editor and I specialize in narrative nonfiction, although I am interested in growing in the area of fiction and particularly romance and literary fiction. So that is kind of the reason behind my interest in manuscript editing as a new challenge. In addition to owning my own business, I also am on the board for the University of Chicago Student Advisory Committee. We pull together the alumni for the editing certificate program and do continuing education opportunities. And I'm also a part of the Strategic Goals Committee for ACES, the Society for Editing. Yeah,
I love it. I love it. I love how involved you are. And I think that's such a big point to have. It speaks to your interest, your expertise, and just your willingness to learn and get involved. And I think that's how we even connected. I actually can't even remember how we met each other, but it's been through several different channels. You know, the more that you're involved, the more that you connect with other editors, it's just so great. It's so great because you learn new things, right? So I have specifically presented on manuscript evaluations several times. And every time I present on this topic, it really opens that discussion that I mentioned briefly about developmental editing. And there are two sides, I feel, and I see this in the evaluations from my presentations, and I see them in the chats if I'm doing them virtually, what other editors are saying to each other. And some are like, well, this seems like it's developmental editing, the way I'm describing the evaluation process. And then others are like, well, no, this is not developmental editing, you know. And so I guess the way I define, and you can also jump in, Steph, and explain how you define developmental editing. For me, it is the actual act of making major changes to a manuscript. It's not full ghostwriting, but it is making structural changes, possibly moving paragraphs, possibly moving chapters around, in a nutshell, just enhancing that structural, whatever the word is for that, the major high level decision making, obviously in collaboration with the author, right? So that's my, I guess, definition of developmental editing. And I guess listeners will understand why we're having this conversation before we get into talking about evaluations. But so what do you think? What is it to you?
Yeah.
What does it mean to you?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I do think there's some gray area, but that's also just the nature of a creative field.
Right.
I think of developmental editing as more of, a surgery, right? It's pretty major. It's somebody's bringing you a manuscript, and they're probably, if they're investing in that service, they're probably already aware that there's some pretty major issues, or maybe they're incredibly stuck and they have some ideas of how they want it to go, but it's just not working. They need someone to kind of like walk through it with them. And so that's kind of how I would define that.
Yes, that's perfect. That's perfect. So let's just jump in. We're really talking about a core service that I provide at Peak Publishing. This is huge, and it became a game changer for my business. Maybe I want to say 4 or 5 years ago. I'll tell a quick story on how I even came up with my process. This is not a new concept, right? Manuscript evaluations are a thing that editors, sometimes writers provide. You don't have to be an editor to do these. However, because I am very biased, I think you are too, I think we would promote that this is a service that editors, it should really be coming from an editor, because we understand the nuance and the technical and the technicalities involved, right? So I was thinking one day, I was just sitting by myself, daydreaming, like, I want to write a book. And I am going to write a book someday, fiction, I'm talking.
Really, I can't
and
wait.
I'm like, I know someday it's going to be a crazy. The last time I tried writing, it turned into sci-fi, and I'm like, oh, I guess I'm a sci-fi writer now. It was weird. I was like, I did not think I would go that way.
Just see where it goes.
Right. You just see where it goes. So I'm thinking about my story that I wanted to revisit. And then I started thinking, yeah, I'm going to, get into the plot. And then I thought, okay, well, who would I choose to be my editor for this book, right? Then I started getting nervous like that, because I know how editors think. We do, like, we get it, right? And then I started getting nervous, like, oh my God, like, that is a very, very vulnerable position to be in when you are handing a man, like, this is art, like you just said. You said this is a creative, especially on the fiction side. This is an art form. And handing it over to somebody who is going to essentially tear it apart in a positive way, right? Because if an editor's doing their job the right way, it's going to be a good tear apart. I'm doing air quotes. Anyway, that nervousness came from that vulnerability. And I thought, what would I want? What is really important to me when I'm passing something off to an editor? As a writer, now I'm in the total headspace of a writer. And I thought, I really want to know the strengths and the weaknesses. And I want to hear ideas and opinions from the editor. Not that I need their creative ideas, but I'd like to hear their suggestions. And then I can then make that decision as a writer. And that is exactly how I developed this process. It's a very systematic process that I have presented on. So why don't you explain my process, Steph? Because that's why I love having you. That's why I'm so happy that you're on the podcast, because you actually are the first editor that I've actually met that has used I know other editors have, but I haven't met them or talked to them about it. But you are the first one who has actually you've used my process, and I'd love to hear your description of it.
Sure. So you presented on this topic for the University of Chicago editing community, I think about a year ago.
Oh, okay.
And it was right around the time of ACES. So I actually think, going back to when we met, I think we met at ACES last year. So coming up on 1 year, because we'll be back there in a couple of weeks. We'll be back there before this airs.
I know we will. I forgot how we met. I swear to God. I'm like, how the hell did we meet?
I think we briefly connected there. And of course at ACES you're meeting, many editors, so you can't remember them all. But then you presented on this, and it was so, I thought the presentation was so instructional. And I think you have this quality about you that makes people feel like they can do anything. And I came out of that like, I can do this. I read quite a lot, and I read broadly. And I enjoy looking at stories and deconstructing stories and, looking at the different pieces and how they fit together. And so the idea of it just excited me. And I think what I did was I reached out to you after that presentation and, we had like a networking meeting, which is, you're always so generous with your time. And I've really leaned heavily on trying to foster some mentorship relationships. And so we had a great conversation. And then I would say about a month later, someone in my network had reached out. They had written a manuscript and they just wanted to get my advice for like, what do they do next? Which I think is really common. I think a lot of writers, they're just trying to like get the idea down on paper, and it's such a huge effort. It's such an accomplishment when you finish it, and then they're in that position of like, well, what now? Right. And so they asked me to coffee and said, I just want to know, where do I go from here? And so the more I listened to them, I asked a lot of questions about, what are your goals? And kind of where do you want to go with this? So once I kind of heard from them, this immediately was at the top of my mind. And I'm like, I think what you want is a manuscript evaluation. I think what you want is for someone to come through as another set of eyes to look at this story and point out like what's working really well. Yes. And where are there maybe a few holes? And every story has holes. I think pretty much every story could benefit from this, because when you're the writer, it's so close to you, and there might even be things that you imagined that you put in there, you're sure you put in there, and then you didn't. So it takes another person looking at it to tell you like, well, what happened to this character? Or, oh gosh, I really like that friendship. I'd love to see that friend continue to show up in the story and be a confidant,
Totally.
So,
I love that you said that. I love that you the thing that you just shared, which is so important, is that writers who come to you, and any editor for that matter, are never going to say, hey, I need a manuscript evaluation. It's very rare that they would ever ask for that, because they are already participating for the most part in writers groups, and they have writers critiques, which are totally different from an evaluation. And I think you hit a nail on the head right now by saying that you basically had to sell this service, right, to the client. You're like, it sounds like this is what you need, because of course they want grammar and punctuation fixed. They want you to review that. But in the evaluation, you're not doing that. You're actually talking about everything you just described, which is the plot, rhythm, pacing, flow, character development. I mean, these are the bigger picture things that are so fun to talk about with writers. And it's so much more in depth than just that writer that letter that you're writing to the author after you do the editing. So anyway, I just wanted to pause for a minute and reflect on the fact that as a freelancer, you will have to sell that service by saying like, this is what you need, and let me tell you why, and it doesn't feel salesy, does it?
Not at all. It felt customized. And I think that's the best way to approach a client is to really listen. Like, what is it that you're actually wanting? Because a lot of them come to you, and most people, unless you're an editor, you probably don't understand all of the different levels of editing.
Right.
And it's so common to not know exactly, you need editing, but you don't know exactly what.
Right.
Right. And when you're able to kind of take the long-term view and address these big picture issues further upstream, it saves so much time and money later on. Yeah. And I would hate to sell someone copy editing services, proofreading services, and then, someone else reads it and says, oh, this isn't working,
Right. And I think that you're also speaking to the fact that as a writer, receiving your manuscript back with all of the edits and a letter, and the letter may or may not include things that address those bigger picture issues. Do you realize like how overwhelming that is for a writer to not only get the editing back, but then this feedback in this letter that feels just like, oh my God, like I'm a bad writer. Like it's almost as much as no matter how, encouraging the editor intends to be, it is still a shock to anybody's system to see track changes. It just is.
Sure.
And it's like, I'm a bad writer. Oh my God, I'm so bad. And this, there's a lot of that negativity because you're seeing these edits being made. And so that's the beauty of these manuscript evaluations, is that there is no editing, right?
Right. Yeah. In fact, I think I just primarily use comments. And then most of the comments are just for me, so that later when I come back through and read through my comments, I can pull out themes
Yeah.
and be like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
But one thing that you really coached me on and encouraged me to do was to put equal effort into calling out what they're doing really well,
Yes.
to kind of, build up that confidence, because it is a vulnerable thing to create a
Yes.
piece of art and then put it into someone else's hands, knowing that, like they have such a personal connection to it.
Yes. Yes. And I that's what I do. So in that process, I almost force, because I create like a template, right? Like it's those boxes, and there's a box for strengths, there's a box for weaknesses, and then a box for suggestions. And it's almost like it taps into my like corporate because I worked as a full-time editor in like a corporate situation before I focused on Peak Publishing. And it's essentially a SWOT analysis, but like condensed because it's strengths, weaknesses, and suggestions, and that's it. But you have to give those for each chapter. So like you said, you're setting aside that equal time to give the author praise. And that is so important, because every chapter does have a strength and weakness. And honestly, in some of my evaluations I've done, some of them actually have no weaknesses. And I will literally just write none in that box, and so that they can feel encouraged. Like, wow, this was a chapter that was just so strong. There's nothing that Nadia has to share about how I can improve it, because it's already a great chapter. And that usually happens at the beginning. So then the author's getting back their report and they see none, for weaknesses. And then you get to that muddy middle. So let's talk about that too.
Sure.
You talked about, I love that you use the word customized. I love that, because that's so, so true about this process. Authors, when you meet, it's not like it's a fast-paced thing where you're just like, okay, let's just do this evaluation. You had to talk about it and almost essentially sell that service. In that conversation, can you explain how your client positioned themselves with their manuscript? Did they share any sort of, I'm assuming that they did, but you tell me, share any sort of apprehension or things that they think already they need help with? Like if it's a plot structure, potential plot holes, character development, anything like that. Did that come up in conversation with you?
Yeah, it did. And it was something that I asked. I said, are there any particular areas that you want me to pay special attention to? Are there any questions you have? And, this author, she's a first-time author, but I'll tell you, she's fantastic. And I'm so excited for this project. I can't wait to see where it goes.
That's awesome.
But I already knew, I had reviewed a chapter. I knew that she was a strong writer. She has an English degree, and she's just very well spoken, very well read. But it was incredibly helpful for me to know where should I focus my attention. And it just so happened that her biggest concern had to do whether or not the prologue worked. The prologue was a flashback.
Oh,
She wanted to know whether that added to the story, whether that was a good place to start. Like, she just really wanted a lot of feedback on that. And
That's great.
so that helped me kind of focus. And then, of course, as I went along, there were other things that I, called out. And
Yeah, that's great. I love that. And it gave you a sense of perspective too on what to look for, so that you are providing that customized level of expertise. So you're not just going into it creating like a cookie cutter. You know what I'm saying? You were actually looking at it and thinking more thoughtfully about your feedback versus just generic. Because let's be honest, you can literally upload your manuscript, not yours, but your clients, which you wouldn't do, but you could upload it to AI. There are AI services out there, right, that can evaluate manuscripts. Now, you could. One could, right?
theoretically.
Theoretically. But why would you, right? I mean, that's the whole point of this process, is like you are providing your your expertise, specifically to Steph Thompson or specifically to Nadia Pupa. We're giving our suggestions based on our experiences. And also, like, if something is shocking to us and it's like, oh my God, a plot twist, or something makes us laugh, you need to tell the author that, right? Like,
Right.
I don't know if you did this, but in my man, in more than one, I have put in like LOL as a comment. And it's effective because
I love
then
that.
the author's like, oh my gosh, good. My joke was funny, or
Yes,
it didn't,
it
it landed. It landed.
Yes.
Exactly. It landed. And you're almost giving that author that pat on the back. So that simple LOL comment in the manuscript is all they need, right?
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the types of things that you caught. Not caught, but just, the things that you evaluated. What were the nature of those things? Earlier you'd mentioned maybe some character development things or characters that maybe some subplots that disappeared and you're like, hey, wait a minute.
Right.
And then gauging the way that you shared those things. So just share a little bit about that. I'd love to hear it.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that I started to notice pretty frequently was just some differences between the characters' point of view. And so this was a romance, and there was a male lead and a female lead.
Yes,
And
there's a
the
lot of
female
those that
lead
exist.
Was very strong, and I felt like that character had been fully developed, whereas the male character had not been quite as developed. And there were times where the male character would just repeat a scene, but maybe
Okay.
didn't offer much of a different perspective. It felt like they had the same perspective. So that's the kind of thing that, like, I kind of commented on a few times. And then when I get to the end and I see that that's kind of a trend, then I just start to ask, like, hey, what do we want to do to strengthen this? Do we still want to keep this a dual perspective? Would you consider doing a single perspective? Would you consider giving him a different outlook on things so that the reader can feel that tension between, what does he know that she doesn't know? What does she know that he doesn't know? And then also
I love it.
wanting to continue to move the story forward. I like that idea of, we can experience something in a very different way than the other person that's in a conversation or in a situation. But I think you can lose the pacing of a story if you repeat a scene, even
Yes.
from a different perspective. So I think that there's other creative ways to do that, whether that's, later you're reflecting on the conversation, or maybe your character's picking up the phone and calling kind of a confidant to say, oh, I just left this date and I don't know what to do with this. And, can you talk me through it? And that's another way to kind of retell a scene without repeating it.
I love that. That's really good feedback. And so tell me, how did the client respond? I mean, this is overall. So like you provided this like report with the strengths, weaknesses, suggestions. You probably gave them their manuscript back with their comments, with your comments. And then did you have a debrief with the author?
Yes.
How did that go? How did that go?
Yes, it was great. I kind of, as I delivered the manuscript evaluation, they were aware that it included a 90-minute debrief meeting where we could just walk through it together. I could answer any questions. If there was anything that felt unclear, they could ask about. And so that was included. And when I sent it off, I just said to them, take some time to sit with this, read through it, make notes, and I'll check back in a few weeks and see if you're ready to schedule our debrief meeting, because you want them to have time to digest it.
Yes.
But if you wait too long, then, then it's not fresh. So,
Right.
And it went well. Again, because this is someone in my network, we met for coffee.
Oh,
we
great.
sat down. I brought the full, 20-page report with me. It ended up being longer than I expected. But, and we just talked it through, and it was a great conversation where
good.
really it was, again, wanting to hear from them. Did this answer your questions? Is there anything I can add on to? And them getting to ask me like, well, how would you handle this? Or what would you think about this? So
That's great.
I really enjoyed that part.
That's awesome. So
Yes.
then what happened after that? So that I feel like that's part of that that evaluation process that is so essential is this debrief. And during that debrief, I mean, there's so much conversation happening. They must feel so empowered to and encouraged to keep going because they had somebody give them those in the weeds, details that you can't get otherwise. And
Right.
this whole process is basically an alpha read. In our industry, we would call it an alpha read, which is so much deeper than what you would get in a beta read. We could call it that, and clients may or may not understand. I think calling it a manuscript evaluation makes more sense. But so tell us what happened after that meeting. Are you still in touch with the client? I mean, I can't imagine not being in touch, but tell us more details.
Oh, yes, absolutely. The client basically took, after our meeting, they took the feedback back and wanted to rework parts of their story. They work full time, so they have a very full schedule, and they
Yep.
kind of set up front, this is going to take me some time, but I'm going to kind of rework some things. And they were excited about kind of applying some changes and making it stronger. And I checked back in with them a few months later, and they are interested in doing a second read. So they,
Awesome.
again, they kind of said, I would just really like for you to read through it, see if, the changes that were implemented, met our goals of
Yeah.
strengthening this story.
That's
and so
great.
that is in the works right now.
That's great. So
Yes.
you essentially establish trust, right? So now this client is looking at you as Steph has my back. She's looking out for me, and I'm going to revise my manuscript and see what she thinks. And at that point, you can charge an hourly rate outside of what you've already charged for the evaluation, right? Is that what you ended up doing?
Yes, I did some market research, and it seemed like the standard was charging, between 50 and 75%, just depending on how much of the manuscript had been changed.
Right.
I came up with a flat fee that I felt like was fair based on what I already know of the manuscript.
Right.
And
right.
so that's kind of how we determined that. I like to work on this type of thing. I like to work in a flat fee because I
Yes.
think it's most fair to everyone. I especially think independent authors, they're investing in their
Yes.
own work.
Right.
We're not to that point where it's a sure thing that it's getting published. It's still early stages.
Right,
And
right.
so I want to give them an idea of what to expect. And it also takes pressure off of me. I don't have to be like, oh, I got to speed up. I got to,
Yes.
I want to take my time and do right by it. So
That makes
yes,
me so
I do
happy.
think a client coming back and asking for more work is the highest compliment to an editor.
Absolutely. It absolutely is. And I knew that was going to happen when you talked to me about this evaluation. I'm like, oh, this
Thank you.
client is going to love this feedback. And I knew that was going to happen. But I love that you said that you base it on a flat rate fee. I think the flat fee is the way to go a lot more often than not in our industry. And so do you base it? I know I do base it on a word count range.
Yes.
Where is your range? Is our range the same? Like 50,000 words. Mine is 50,000
looked at
words to
it.
80.
Is it okay?
That's my
50
flat
to 80.
fee.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think I copied that from you. I think that was
okay.
part of your presentation, and I copied that. And then
It's a
anything
good
over
range.
80, anything
Yeah.
over 80, I think I've come up with a rate structure for.
Yeah, same. And
Same
then
for you? Okay.
same for me. And I've had things that were lower than 50,000 words, and I lower my fee accordingly. So it's a scale. And I think that most books, substantial books, range between 50 to 80. I think that's a common range of word count there. So
Yes, I agree.
so this is so awesome. And I love that
Yeah,
you
thanks.
you shared your process, you shared your mentality going into it, how writers can benefit from your expertise. This is such a methodical process, and it's so great because it's taking the load off your shoulders to dive in and edit a manuscript that's probably not ready. And so
Exactly.
a lot of freelance editors meet those first-time writers, which is amazing. But I think that you could lead them astray unintentionally if you're too harsh or heavy-handed with your edits. And that's not the case with these evaluations. So I predict that this will continue to be a game changer for editors who embrace this process. But please, Steph, share any words of advice or words of wisdom that you would like to express to freelancers who are maybe apprehensive to start, providing this service. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely felt a little apprehensive at first. Like I said, coming off your talk, I was like, I can do this. I can do anything. But it is scary when you're new at something. You feel that tension of, you can be confident in your own skills, but you also feel that pressure of wanting to do right by your client and provide value for them. So I think the best thing I did is reach out to a couple of mentors, you being one of them, and then Barbie Halaby. I don't know if you know Barbie.
I love Barbie. Yes.
Yes. She also similarly kind of looked over my notes and gave me feedback, and a lot of it was really similar. It's like, okay, you've done so well in this, constructive, actionable feedback. Let's also go back through and call out what they're doing well.
Yes.
And not just assume that they know that what they're doing well. So I guess I think in the freelance editing profession, if you're newer or if you're learning something new, I'm just a big believer in looking for mentors. And you have to seek them out yourself. They should be organic. They should be people that you have crossed paths with and kind of click with. And I've really benefited from that. That's been huge for me.
Oh, that makes me so happy. This is such encouraging. What you shared is so encouraging for freelance editors, for anybody interested in exploring adjacent skills. And that's exactly what this is. So we will continue this conversation. We can talk a little bit more about the business side and really how to develop and strengthen these skills in our exclusive interview, which we will begin in a few more minutes. But before we do, I want to thank you again. And honestly, I forgot to mention that to access this exclusive interview, you do have to become a Patreon supporter. Forgot to mention that important tidbit. Go to my patreon.com/editors half hour to join as a peak, air quotes around peak, spelled PIQUE, peak supporter, sneak peek supporter. $5 a month will get you access to these exclusive interviews. So again, I can't thank you enough, Steph, for taking the time to do this interview. It was so special and it was so encouraging to just hear your perspective. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm honored.
Thank you for listening to the Editor's Half Hour. This podcast is your go-to resource for editorial trends, opening the discussion for new ideas through the real-life stories of editors. For more information about Nadia Jaja Pupa and her business, visit peakpublishing.com. That's PIQUE publishing.com. And remember to subscribe and follow the Editor's Half Hour wherever you get your podcasts.